On an ordinary evening in the quiet town of Maplewood, James Holloway's life took a turn he never expected. For nearly 2 decades he had lived a life that was simple and routine, working long shifts at the local factory and returning home to the modest house he shared with his wife Claire. The days often blurred together: wake up before dawn, work until his back ached, return home tired, eat dinner, and repeat it all again the next morning. Vacations were rare, luxuries even rarer, but James carried on with quiet determination, the kind of man who believed hard work and persistence were all he had. He was not a man given to fantasies, and yet one small decision shifted everything. It happened one Friday evening. James had stopped at a small gas station on the edge of town, a place he often visited for cigarettes and a soda before heading home. As he waited in line, his eyes drifted to the display of brightly colored lottery tickets behind the counter. He had never been much of a gambler, usually scoffing at the idea of throwing money away on games of chance. But something that night nudged him forward, a fleeting impulse he couldn't explain. With a shrug, he handed the clerk a couple of crumpled bills and asked for one ticket. It felt like nothing in the moment, just a passing whim, but the piece of paper he slid into his wallet carried the potential to change everything. For a few days, James forgot all about it. The ticket remained tucked between old receipts and a photo of him and Claire at their wedding. When he finally scratched it in the kitchen one evening, he expected nothing. He sat at the table, glasses perched low on his nose, idly scraping away the silver film with a coin. At first, his brain didn't register the numbers. Then it hit him like a jolt of electricity. He checked once, twice, 3 times, his hands trembling as he read the results. $99,800. Almost $100,000. The figure danced in his head, impossible yet real. His heart pounded as he realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't bound by the paycheck-to-paycheck existence that had defined him for years. The house suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier with possibility. He wanted to shout, to tell someone immediately. He imagined paying off lingering debts, repairing the roof that leaked every time it rained, maybe even replacing the old car that coughed and wheezed every morning. But more than anything, James felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope. He wasn't trapped anymore, not in the way he used to be. The win wasn't millions, but it was enough to ease the weight he had carried on his shoulders for decades. Claire was the first to know. She found him standing in the kitchen with wide eyes and a paper clutched tightly in his fist. She appeared overjoyed at the news, throwing her arms around him, her voice full of excitement. Together they laughed, and James allowed himself to believe this was the start of something better for both of them. Word spread quickly, as it always does in small towns. Neighbors congratulated him, co-workers slapped him on the back, and even distant relatives called to share in the excitement. For once, James was the man everyone wanted to talk to. He told anyone who would listen that he wanted to be smart with the money. No lavish purchases, no reckless spending. He dreamed of stability, not extravagance. He talked of paying off the mortgage, setting aside savings, and maybe taking a modest trip to the coast. People admired his humility, noting how James remained the same grounded man he had always been. Yet in the shadows of his newfound fortune, a quiet shift began to stir in Claire. She nodded and agreed with his plans, smiling at his talk of responsibility and future security. But behind her eyes was something James did not see. Where he envisioned safety and stability, she began to see chains. While he saw the winnings as a way to finally breathe, she saw it as a chance to escape. For years she had lived alongside James in that small house, watching him toil away at work and settling for a life that seemed destined never to rise above ordinary. She had once shared his dreams of modest comfort, but over time dissatisfaction had taken root. Now, with the sudden appearance of nearly $100,000, her mind wandered down darker and more selfish paths. The town celebrated James as a man blessed with rare luck, a man who had worked tirelessly and finally been rewarded. But luck has a way of turning sour when greed enters the picture. James had no way of knowing that his prize, the ticket that had brought him so much joy, would soon set in motion events that would unravel everything. What he saw as a blessing would become a curse, and what he hoped would strengthen his marriage would instead expose the fault lines already hidden beneath the surface. As the days passed after the lottery win, James settled back into his usual routine, though his life felt lighter. He would rise early for his shift at the factory, come home tired but smiling, and speak endlessly about plans for their future. He told anyone who asked that he wanted to be careful with the money, to avoid waste, to make sure they had security. His co-workers admired his restraint, calling him wise, but at home, Claire began to see him differently. To her, James's caution was not wisdom. It was limitation. The money in her eyes was a golden key, a once-in-a-lifetime chance to break free, and James's reluctance to indulge seemed like a prison built out of fear. At first, Claire hid her disappointment well. She clapped when he spoke of paying off their mortgage, nodding as he explained how they could clear their debts. She smiled when he mentioned fixing the old roof, pretending to share his excitement about repainting the kitchen. But deep inside, a restless current stirred. She wanted more than patched walls and second-hand cars. She wanted the kind of life she believed she had been denied all these years, the clothes she had never worn, the places she had never visited, the freedom she had only dreamed about in the dark when James was asleep beside her. Everywhere Claire looked, she saw possibilities slipping through her fingers. When neighbors came by to congratulate them, she noticed the envy in their eyes, and it gave her a taste of what she thought she deserved. Admiration, status, power. When she walked through town, she imagined herself in a different life, one where she was not tied to James's cautious nature. She began to resent him for holding her back, even though he had done nothing but try to be responsible. It didn't take long for small cracks to appear between them. James would mention how he wanted to invest the money into repairs, while Claire suggested more extravagant options, a new car, a vacation abroad, maybe even moving to a larger home. James would shake his head, reminding her that the money could vanish quickly if they weren't careful. He would lecture about security, about not making foolish choices. To him, it was practical advice. To her, it sounded like a cage. Each refusal deepened her frustration until every conversation about the winnings felt like a battle she could never win. At night, when James fell asleep, Claire would lie awake staring at the ceiling. She thought about what that money meant, not just comfort, but freedom. She could start over, go somewhere far away, live the life she had always imagined. But as long as James was alive, she would never truly have control over it. The money belonged to both of them, and he would always stand between her and the future she envisioned. The thought settled in her mind like a poison, growing darker each day. She started to notice how people looked at James differently. Since the win, friends and relatives called more often, asking how he planned to use the money, offering suggestions and advice. He enjoyed the attention, his face lighting up whenever someone praised his restraint. But Claire watched all of this with bitterness. She thought about how invisible she had become, how no one seemed to recognize that half of the money was hers. It was always James they spoke to, James they congratulated, James they admired. Her jealousy deepened into something heavier, something dangerous. Claire began imagining what her life would be like if James weren't in it. The thought started as a fleeting whisper, an idea she quickly shoved aside, but it returned again and again, stronger each time. She pictured herself alone, holding the entire sum in her hands. No one to argue with, no lectures about responsibility. For the first time, she allowed herself to think the unthinkable, that perhaps James's presence was the only obstacle between her and the life she wanted. Her resentment transformed into quiet planning. She watched James closely, noting his habits. The times he was alone, the moments he was most vulnerable. She searched for weaknesses in the rhythm of their daily life. The love that had once existed between them seemed to vanish, replaced by calculation. She smiled in public, laughed at his jokes when others were around, but inside she was already separating herself from him, convincing herself that she deserved more than what he was willing to give. James noticed none of this. To him, Claire was still his partner, his confidant, the person who had stood by him through years of struggle. He trusted her completely, never suspecting the storm brewing just beneath her calm surface. He believed their arguments were small disagreements, the kind every couple had. But for Claire, those arguments were proof that he would never change, that his dreams would always be smaller than hers. As the weeks went on, Claire's mind no longer drifted toward possibility. It fixated on inevitability. The thought of James's death was no longer shocking to her. It had become a solution, a way to unlock the life she craved. Each time she looked at him, she didn't just see her husband, she saw a wall standing between her and nearly $100,000, and with each passing day, she grew more determined to tear that wall down, no matter the cost. Claire's thoughts no longer wandered in vague directions. They sharpened into something deliberate. The idea of removing James had taken root, and was growing stronger with every passing day. What had once been a fleeting fantasy became a plan she fed with constant attention. She spent late nights on the computer while James slept, searching through articles and forums, trying to understand how people had concealed crimes before. She read about methods that looked like accidents, ways that left little trace, strategies that could be explained away as bad luck or misfortune. The more she read, the more emboldened she felt. It was as though the money itself whispered to her, convincing her that she deserved it, that it was waiting for her to claim it if she was only willing to act. Her decision solidified during an evening storm. Rain battered against the roof. Wind howled through the trees, and James, exhausted from work and a celebratory drink, slumped into his recliner. He had spent part of the day proudly telling friends that the last of his debts were gone. He had toasted to a future that now felt within reach. As he sat with a half-empty glass in hand, his eyes grew heavy, and before long he drifted into a deep sleep. To Claire, the timing felt almost designed. The storm outside would mask any noise, the darkness would cloak her actions, and James's condition left him defenseless. She moved around the house quietly, her mind racing yet focused. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her face remained calm, her body steady. She told herself this was necessary, that James had lived his life in small, cautious ways, and that she could not let him dictate hers any longer. She had convinced herself that she was taking control, stepping into a destiny that was rightfully hers. With the storm as her cover, she carried out her plan with chilling precision. The moment itself passed quickly, almost without sound. James never woke to fight back, never had the chance to realize what was happening. To anyone else, it would seem as though he had slipped away in the middle of a stormy night, taken by fate rather than human hands. Claire stood over him afterward, her breathing shallow but steady, staring at what she had done. The silence in the house was deafening, broken only by the rhythm of rain against the windows. She had crossed a line from which there was no return. But instead of regret, she felt only cold determination. She spent the rest of the night staging the scene. She made sure that nothing appeared out of place, no signs of struggle, no clues that might suggest foul play. The storm's chaos outside seemed to work in her favor. Fallen branches and power outages gave her story credibility before she had even spoken a word. By the time morning arrived, Claire had crafted a version of events she would present to the world. James had gone to bed after drinking. She would explain. The storm had unsettled him. Sometime in the night he had passed away suddenly. Her performance was ready. When she finally called for help, her voice carried the tremor of a grieving wife. Neighbors rushed to the house, concerned, sympathetic, unaware of the truth that lay hidden in the details. They offered her comfort, believed her tears, and whispered about the tragedy of a man whose life had just begun to turn around, only to be cut short. The irony of the situation deepened the sorrow around the neighborhood. People shook their heads, remarking how unfair it was that fortune had smiled on James only to snatch him away. Claire, standing amidst the pity and condolences, maintained her role flawlessly. She accepted hugs, wiped her eyes at the right moments, and spoke softly of how much she would miss him. Inside, however, she felt an almost mechanical detachment. She had achieved what she had set out to do. The money would be hers alone now, the life she imagined within reach. She believed she had carried out the perfect plan. Yet even in those early hours, small details lingered in the background, threads that would later begin to unravel her carefully constructed story. The medical examiner's report would not match her description of a peaceful passing. Marks she thought would be overlooked would draw suspicion. The storm had covered some sounds, but it had not erased every trace. What Claire failed to consider in her cold calculation was that perfection in crime rarely exists. But for now, in the immediate aftermath, she felt secure. She had convinced herself that her performance as a widow would protect her, that her grief would shield her from scrutiny. She was ready to move forward, to transfer the winnings solely into her possession. As she lay in bed that night alone for the first time in years, she did not feel haunted by James. She felt the weight of possibility pressing in on her, as though the world was finally opening. She could not see that the very thing she believed had freed her would soon become the evidence that destroyed her. The morning after James's death, Claire's performance as a grieving widow began in earnest. She played her role with precision, her tears flowing on command, her voice trembling just enough to convince everyone that shock and sorrow consumed her. Neighbors stopped by, bringing food and offering condolences, their faces heavy with pity. To them, Claire was a woman blindsided by tragedy, left alone after her husband's sudden passing. She clutched their hands, thanked them softly, and spoke of how James had seemed so happy the day before, how no one could have expected this. Every word was carefully chosen to strengthen the illusion she needed everyone to believe. The storm from the night before worked in her favor. Power lines were down across town, trees had snapped, and small damages dotted the neighborhood. Everyone spoke of how it had been one of the fiercest storms in years. Claire used that chaos to her advantage, weaving it into her story. She told anyone who asked that James had been unsettled that evening, that he had gone to bed complaining of feeling unwell, and that she had discovered him lifeless in the morning. The weather became her scapegoat, a natural veil that hid the unnatural truth of what had happened inside their home. As arrangements were made for James's funeral, Claire turned her attention quietly toward the money. She visited the bank, explaining her circumstances with the composure of a woman handling business during grief. She asked about transferring the funds fully into her account, ensuring she would have sole access. She masked her eagerness with sorrow, presenting herself as someone simply trying to settle her affairs after an unexpected loss. Bank clerks sympathized, neighbors praised her strength, and relatives offered their support. To the outside world, she was handling tragedy with remarkable grace. Inside, she was focused entirely on securing the prize. But her plan was not as flawless as she believed. The coroner's report raised the first quiet alarm. James's injuries did not align with the story Claire told. There were marks that could not be explained by natural causes, details that suggested something more than a sudden collapse in the night. Though the official paperwork did not scream murder, it whispered questions that investigators could not ignore. Detectives began to revisit the scene, taking note of things they had overlooked in the chaos of that stormy morning. Claire remained unaware of these suspicions at first. She thought she had convinced everyone, and for a time, it seemed she had. She accepted condolences at the funeral, her black dress and solemn expression convincing the crowd of mourners that her heart was broken. She listened to stories of James's kindness, his hard work, his sudden stroke of luck with the lottery, and she bowed her head as if the pain was too much to bear. Yet behind the mask she was already calculating how soon she could move on, how quickly she could claim the money that had cost her husband his life. Detectives, however, were patient. They did not accuse her outright. Instead, they gathered pieces quietly, like assembling a puzzle in secret. They studied bank records, noting how quickly she had tried to claim the funds. They found her late-night internet searches, buried in the browser history she thought she had erased. They spoke to neighbors who recalled small arguments between her and James about how the winnings should be spent. Each fragment by itself seemed harmless, but together they began to form a darker picture. Claire sensed the shift slowly. At first it was nothing more than a strange tone in the questions. Detectives asked, An extra pause as they wrote in their notebooks. Then came longer interviews. More detailed inquiries about her version of events. She repeated her story again and again, insisting that James had gone to bed after drinking and never woken up. She emphasized the storm, the chaos, the shock. But with each retelling her voice grew tighter, the cracks harder to hide. Despite her fear, she maintained her role in public. She continued to present herself as the grieving widow, her sorrow convincing enough for most people around her. But privately, she began to feel the weight of the investigation pressing in. The very storm she thought had concealed her crime had also drawn attention. Investigators knew that unusual circumstances often masked something more sinister, and they were no longer willing to take her story at face value. Claire clung to her belief that she had been smarter than everyone else, that her careful planning and staged grief would protect her. She convinced herself that suspicion was normal, that nothing concrete tied her to the act. Yet the truth was already unraveling beneath her feet, piece by piece, in ways she could not control. She had set the stage for the perfect cover-up, but perfection in crime is an illusion. The mask she wore so carefully was beginning to slip, and soon the world would see her not as a widow but as a woman who had traded her husband's life for the promise of wealth. The investigation that had started as a routine inquiry into a sudden death began to intensify with each passing week. Detectives grew less convinced by Claire's performance, and more interested in the inconsistencies that kept appearing. What troubled them most was not just James's death, but the timing. A man who had struggled financially his entire life suddenly won nearly $100,000, and within weeks he was dead. To seasoned investigators, coincidence of that magnitude rarely existed. The evidence that undermined Claire's story accumulated slowly but surely. The autopsy revealed details that could not be dismissed. The marks on James's body suggested force, not natural causes. His level of intoxication that night made him vulnerable, but it could not explain the injuries found. Toxicology showed nothing unusual, ruling out a natural collapse from unknown illness. Piece by piece, the medical evidence painted a picture that contradicted Claire's tale of a quiet passing during a storm. Detectives turned their focus to Claire's behavior. They discovered how quickly she had attempted to transfer the lottery winnings into her sole account, even before the funeral was over. They reviewed her phone and computer, uncovering searches that made her motives clear, articles on how to stage an accident, methods to ensure a death appeared natural, and questions about inheritance law. These findings were quietly shared among the investigative team, each new discovery tightening the net around her. The turning point came when financial records revealed her impatience. While she publicly played the role of a grieving widow, privately she had contacted lawyers and financial advisors, eager to secure control of the winnings as fast as possible. When questioned about these actions, Claire insisted she was only trying to manage responsibilities, but her explanations rang hollow. Detectives noted her rehearsed answers, the way she grew defensive when pressed, the way her eyes darted whenever the topic of money arose. By now, the community that had once surrounded her with sympathy began to whisper. People remembered the arguments between her and James over how to use the money. They recalled moments when she had appeared frustrated at his caution. Neighbors who initially saw her as a victim began to wonder if she had been something else all along. What had once been pity turned into suspicion, and Claire could feel the change in how people looked at her. The day of her arrest arrived quietly. Detectives approached her at home, asking her to come in for further questioning. She agreed, still believing she could talk her way through as she had before, but this time, the evidence was waiting for her in a neat file, undeniable and damning. They laid it out piece by piece. The autopsy results, the bank records, the internet searches, the testimonies from neighbors. With each page turned, the image of a grieving widow crumbled, replaced by the outline of a calculating woman who had sacrificed her husband for money. Claire tried to maintain her composure, but cracks quickly appeared. Her answers faltered, her explanations contradicted each other, and her confidence drained as the weight of the evidence pressed against her. In the end, the investigators did not need a confession. The evidence spoke louder than her denials, and the conclusion became unavoidable. She was charged with murder, her mask finally stripped away. The trial that followed captured the attention of the community and beyond. Newspapers told the story of the husband who had been blessed with sudden fortune and the wife who had turned it into tragedy. In court, prosecutors painted Claire as a woman consumed by greed, willing to kill for control of a prize that should have been a gift to both of them. The defense tried to argue innocence, to suggest coincidence and misinterpretation. But the mountain of evidence proved too great. The jury listened, weighed the facts, and saw through the lies. When the verdict was read, Claire sat motionless, her expression empty, as the judge declared her guilty of murder. She was sentenced to life in prison. The money she had coveted seized as evidence, and eventually absorbed into legal fees and state claims. The fortune that had sparked so much destruction vanished into nothing, leaving behind only loss and regret. For the people of Maplewood, the case became a chilling reminder of how greed can twist ordinary lives into nightmares. James had dreamed of using the winnings to build stability, to give his family peace after years of struggle. Instead, his prize became the weapon of his downfall. Claire, who had once been seen as his partner, was revealed as his betrayer, her ambition consuming the very life she had vowed to share. The story of James and Claire Holloway lives on as a cautionary tale, retold in whispers and documentaries, a dark example of how sudden fortune can reveal the darkest corners of the human heart. A lottery ticket worth $99,800 promised happiness, but delivered ruin. It showed that money, when paired with unchecked desire, can become a motive stronger than love, loyalty, or morality. And in the end, it left behind nothing but a ruined life, a wasted fortune, and a name forever tied to betrayal and tragedy.